I'm this discussion is on about the fifth year anniversary of lockdown. The show that I had originally that was called I can't even remember what it's called. I think it was called Stay Home for Labour. Started 5 years ago and was started because people were locked down. That's the whole reason I'm still doing these Zoom shows. It's a legacy of lockdown. So I'm grateful to lockdown for that. Um, but we've got two people who have joined the Zoom with me to discuss the 5 year anniversary. Firstly, we've got Joan Twelves. Hi, Joan. How you doing?
Hi, fine, thanks.
Would you introduce yourself? Let people know what your background is on, especially relating to the COVID lockdown issue.
Um, about oh, I've been shielding for 5 years because I'm immunosuppressed. So that's always been my starting point in relation to COVID. So I then got involved with zero COVID, which then became COVID Action, and I'm currently on their steering committee.
Right. And you spoke during the lockdown. We spoke. That's how I've got back in touch with you.
Mhm.
You spoke then.
Yeah.
And also on the call is Heiko Koo, who we also spoke to at that time. What would you like to say about your background with this issue, Heiko?
I was a journalist with the Chinese State Council, so china.org.cn, and I've been writing for them since 2009. And I initially took a position that was in favor of a theoretical eradication through, the measures that were taken roughly. But I, I, the more I investigated it, the more I disagreed with what I initially said, and uh, I lost my job over it. And at the same time, my colleague died um, with COVID or from COVID, and I studied what happened in China, and I wrote an extensive series of research articles on what happened in China, and towards the end of 2021 to 2023, I was finishing that.
Just to start the discussion, I've got some survey results that are very revealing and take us back to what people were feeling like in June 2021. That's when these surveys were taken, and there's quite a number of people who answered. I mean, this is the background, I suppose, to the answers that you'll see afterwards. Have you received two doses of the COVID vaccine? So at that point, 85% of those answering the survey had received two doses of the vaccine. And then, if we look at this, are you afraid of being infected with COVID? 65% were afraid. I mean, despite even many of them, many of them having had two doses of vaccine. Are you afraid of dying from COVID? 50-50 answer, um, which is a bit surprising to me. I mean, I would have thought the two doses was kind of enough for people to feel safe about that. Will you feel safe without social distancing in place? No, 74%. So even though they'd had the vaccine, many of them, three-quarters of the people responding did not feel safe about social distancing. Are you afraid of people entering this country from abroad? 66% were afraid. Do you think lockdown should end in July, as this was in June? No, nearly 50%. So even though many had had vaccines, I say double vaccine. Um, then we've got, do you think children should be vaccinated against COVID? Yes, 62%. Looking at those results, the thing that surprises me, as I say, is that so many had had two doses of the vaccine, yet were fearful of the lockdown ending, fearful of people coming into the country. Do you think that the fear of COVID was off the scale at that point. I mean, is it? I mean, at the time, people were very fearful of it. What's your take on that, Joan?
It's actually very interesting. I'm quite surprised because that was the middle of 21 rather than in 2020 because although at the same time, I mean, the vaccine only started at the beginning of 21, and I must say I remember feeling quite relieved when I got my first vaccine. I hadn't realised how fearful I was until you suddenly think, oh, this might help. I've had about 8 shots of the vaccine. I still don't go to anywhere crowded. I haven't been to a pub for 5 years. I haven't been to a cinema or a theatre for 5 years. Not because I'm scared of dying from COVID, but I actually just don't really want to be ill from COVID. I think that's more scary when you're somebody who's very vulnerable to it. There are lots of people who are still not going out. The last figures I saw was something in the region of 2 million. And there's another 2 million with long COVID who are very nervous about catching COVID again. So yes, on one level, it's officially over, but it's very clear from those statistics that however much people are being told, it's fine, because Boris was trying to tell us it was fine as soon as he could, wasn't he? People were making up their own minds of being careful, that they really didn't want to get sick and they didn't want their families to get sick because so many people by then knew people who died or were really ill from COVID. It wasn't something that was kind of outside their experience.
I mean, bearing in mind that people are not social distancing, masks are not being worn by as many people. Still, people are wearing masks. Some people.
I do.
Are you surprised that the number of people being reported to have been killed or in long COVID isn't higher?
Um, well, we don't have any statistics now because one of the things the government shut down was all the surveys. So on one level, it's quite difficult to know. But I mean, there are still deaths. There were 81 in the week up to the 7th of March. And there's still nearly 1,000 people being hospitalized. And this is when COVID is at a very low level compared to it goes in peaks and troughs. And it's at quite a low level now. Um, and it's actually been flu, which has been more dominant this winter and people being really ill from it. Um, so I think it's a mixture of things, isn't it? That's how people react. Everybody's trying to forget it. They're trying to pretend that they don't want it's not going to happen. Um, but then they get sick again. And I do tend to say to people, masks aren't just about COVID. You wouldn't get flu or colds if you go on the Northern Line in a mask. It might actually protect you.
Heiko, do you think that it's still as prevalent as it was in 2019 now? I mean that we're just not being reported. It's not
No,
being
we
reported.
just stopped testing, that's all.
It's the same prevalence as then.
Probably
Well,
about the same prevalence. I mean, what happens each season is different, either coronaviruses or flu viruses or other pathogens affect the body, affect the lungs, affect the mucosa in the nasal passage, in the back of the throat, and down to the lungs. Most of the protection that people get is in the mucal cells. So there's immunity in the mucus, in your snot, basically. There is immune cells in there that react to past experiences of infections with viruses and with other pathogens or bacteria. And each of them cross-react. All coronaviruses have the same shape. They're corona. They have a crown on them. So there is cross-reactivity in the immune system to those crown viruses. It doesn't matter whether it's the most benign coronavirus or the most supposedly deadly coronavirus. People develop immunity from one to the other. There's a cross immunity between them. The consequence of that is if you've been infected, as all children have, with 4 of the common coronaviruses by the time they're 15, then they have pretty much lifelong what is called immunity. Now, I understand if someone has a weakened immune system, that's a slightly different issue, or a compromised immune system. But in general, nearly every person on Earth has cross immunity to coronaviruses, to all coronaviruses. It doesn't matter how they change. It doesn't matter whether they're adulterated in a lab or whatever. Immunity to coronaviruses is a universal thing, and that was proven by the challenge study carried out in Britain, where they took, so they invited, you may remember that early on they invited, we are going to invite people in to be the heroes who are tested on on SARS-CoV-2. And what they did was they took 36 healthy young people, they sat them back in I think it was Imperial College, and they dropped coronavirus directly into their nasal passage and kept it like that for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And then, so they infected them deliberately with SARS-CoV-2, and half of them had no detectable SARS-CoV-2 in their body, none, half of them. And one person came down a little bit ill, but otherwise nobody was good. But they were young people. So this is an indication that the theoretical framework that has always been in place until 2019, that there is cross immunity between coronaviruses, was always valid and had simply been ignored. They pretended that there was no immunity to it. There was general immunity. And by immunity, I don't mean people don't become ill. I mean they generally don't die from it. That's what I mean by immunity. Immunity, it doesn't mean you don't become ill. Every few years you'll become ill for one reason or another.
So the 250,000 people in this country whose death certificates included COVID-19 did not die from it. The number of excess
Most of them
deaths,
didn't, yes. Most of them didn't.
The number of excess deaths.
Yeah.
The excess wasn't an excess. It was normal. I don't believe that. Well, I'm not a scientific researcher. I'm a community politician.
Okay.
I do not think that many people believe that COVID did not exist. We know it, most of us, by common sense, know it's part of a coronavirus and of the same family as colds, but that and of SARS, but that doesn't mean that it didn't mutate in such a way that it caused massive numbers of deaths around the world, not just in this country. And they were not all people who had compromised immune systems, nor were they people with underlying conditions. There was a lot of young, healthy people who died from COVID.
What would you like to say to that, Heiko?
Well, the excess deaths that happened at that time certainly did exist. And I'm not saying that nobody died from COVID. What I'm saying is that the category that was used to define COVID deaths and to regulate human society was not those people who died from COVID. It was dying with COVID. Now, according to the government statistics, there were freedom of information requests made about this in Britain, for example. Only a very small proportion, a very, very small proportion of those who died from COVID. Now, that doesn't mean that the illness that hit them didn't push them over the edge. Many of the people who died over the edge. There were also other factors that were involved in that. And we can tell that there's something amiss because, yes, there were excess deaths in 2020, but there are still excess deaths now, and they're not COVID related. So, in fact, if there are excess deaths in 2020, so if this is the normal rate of death of the 5-year period, and there are excess deaths in 2020, then it would be natural that if COVID was no longer being the main cause of those excess deaths, that in subsequent years, the excess deaths, there should be a lower level of deaths than after the wave had killed people who were more likely to die because of their age and their general condition. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, and for example, Dr. John Campbell has been asking this again and again for about 2 years, having been a proponent of the vaccines and a proponent of all the measures that were advocated by the governments around the world, even more strong than what the governments advocated. And yet he has been banging on for 2 years now as to why there are excess deaths now. There should not be any excess deaths now. There should be a lower level of death rate than the normal. and yet the excess deaths have continued. And the implication is, from what Dr. John Campbell has been arguing, by studying all the latest research papers, peer-reviewed research papers which come out, is that there's a direct correlation, in the same way as there's a correlation between the discovery of SARS-CoV-2 and large numbers of people, or of excess deaths happening in 2020, for example, and some in 2021. There is a direct correlation between the rollout of mRNA vaccines and excess deaths subsequent to that. Whether that's causation or not has not been fully proven yet, but certainly a very, very, very strong correlation between the widespread use of mRNA vaccines and multiple forms of excess death since that time, caused by immunoresponses, which could have been alleged to be provoked by the mRNA spike
Couldn't they also
protein
have been
implanted in the
provoked by
body.
people who have had COVID? And it's
What was
one
that,
of
sorry?
the. Couldn't those immunoresponses also be provoked by people who've had COVID, possibly as quite mildly, had it repeatedly, and then suddenly discovered they've got long COVID, which is clearly an immunoresponse to COVID, not to the vaccines. So why does it have to be the vaccines?
It doesn't have to be the vaccines, but it's a very, very strong correlation. The reason being is that the types of deaths which are have been happening since, in other words, non-COVID deaths that are excess deaths since 2021, have been multiple types of diseases that are related to immunoresponses, particularly in the blood circulation system. So pericarditis, brain tumor, blood clots, and so on. These are particularly prevalent, but there's also a lot of discussion about turbo cancers and all sorts of other things, which are not really related to COVID. And the problem is, with the long COVID argument, it's very difficult to differentiate between people who have got long COVID and people who received mRNA vaccines. And the way to check this would actually be, there would be a way to verify this, and this would be to compare the data in those countries that did not take the mRNA vaccines. For example, the People's Republic of China refused to take mRNA vaccines. And so if you actually had comparative studies done in China and in the West, then you would be able to see whether the mRNA vaccines were the cause of those specific types of deaths, because in China they didn't receive they didn't receive those vaccines. And most old people in China, it's a cultural phenomena. Most old people in China, or very large numbers, put it that way, you're talking about 40 to 50% of people in China who are over 60 refuse to take the vaccines in China, even the Chinese ones. That's not the mRNA, just the attenuated virus vaccines. And so it will be possible at some stage to verify whether there's a direct correlation between, a direct connection between these excess deaths in the Western world and the mRNA vaccines. But I strongly suspect that they are directly tied together.
When for example, Heiko talks about the vaccine and questions that, do you think that he is being a conspiracy theorist, or do you think that, I mean, in a kind of negative way of saying that, or do you think that he has a good reason to not trust something that the government is producing under, that's been done at a very quick turnaround? I mean, that vaccine wasn't really tested. I mean, it's not that kind of crazy to think, well, maybe it's not safe. Can you see his point there?
I can see his point, but I've had 8 shots of it, so I'm not particularly going to go along and say, oh, it's not safe. I take a lot of drugs, an awful lot of pills of various sorts, some of which are not kind of been around that long and get changed on a frequent basis because I have Crohn's disease. I actually think that vaccines, whether they're created quickly or not, are one of the wonders of modern medical science. I'm old enough to remember when there weren't vaccines for an awful lot of things like polio. My son had measles before there was a vaccine against it. So therefore, I think vaccines are really, really important, and they have saved thousands of lives, if not millions, the COVID vaccines. Yeah, some people will react against them. I know that. I've got two nephews who reacted in the States quite badly against them. But that doesn't mean that the majority should be, we should go around telling people that they're not good for you. I think
So,
vaccines are really, really important.
Heiko, you've not taken the vaccine, I'm assuming.
No.
Oh, did you feel that did you feel pressure to take it? What did you feel about at that time when people were saying that you might be endangering others by not taking it?
By that time, I didn't believe a word they were saying. Um, I think it's important also to go to sort of fundamentals. And I think the discussion to some degree has shifted in that direction. And that is, what is health? What is a healthy body? And what is medicine? In China, they had the advantage in that they have a long tradition of what's called Chinese traditional medicine. And most of the older population trust Chinese traditional medicine more than they trust Western medicine. So one of the elements of that is that they have a sense of physical well-being through exercise. So Tai Chi, Qigong, eating particular the food culture in China, food and health are integral together. And it certainly is, in my opinion, anyway, and I've lived in China for a little while, observed the older people with their feet above their head doing exercises and flexibility at 80 and 90 years of age that I didn't have when I was 30 and 25 years of age. And so if you look at the evidence from around the Western world, around a third, or sorry, the third largest cause of death is the misuse of pharmaceuticals. So I think we need to look more at how a human body and how society maintains its health rather than looking towards treatments, medicine, and pharmaceuticals, which are under the control. When Jeremy Corbyn stood for election in 2019, they wrote a good piece in their manifesto about the pharmaceutical industry being in the pay of big business interests who had an interest. For example, the opioid epidemic in America, the fentanyl epidemic in America, killed more people in terms of life years lost, far more people than COVID, even according to the most exaggerated figures, than COVID did, because the people dying of the opioid epidemic in hundreds of thousands every year are young people. They're not people of 70, 80 years of age. They're young people dying of this. And that's directly as a result of the pharmaceutical industry pushing these drugs onto the population. And it's the same in the West, in my opinion. It's the same with statins, for example. They've promoted the idea that everybody at a certain age is at risk of getting clogged up arteries, and therefore you must take statins. And they tell you by the time you get to 40 or 50 years of age, now's your time for the statin, get on the statin chain. The point being is that medicines and pharmaceuticals under capitalism have become an instrument of financial gain. And that's the primary focus of these pharmaceutical companies. And so
I
it's
don't
natural.
disagree with you about the role of big pharma at all, right? They are clearly in it for profit, and that's what they do. And they screw the NHS in terms of the prices they levy on them, and certainly in terms of anything to do with healthcare in the States, where my son lives, is a nightmare. However, and there is a big but here. I would have died when I was 18 if I hadn't had medication available to me. And I spent 15 years not being able to do very much. And it was a change in medication that had been discovered in the end of the 90s that allow me now to live a reasonably active life. I won't say active because I've got a very bad back. But And, the drugs I'm on that allowed me to do that cost the NHS £3,000 a shot. I have no problem in denouncing Big Pharma for making profits. And I certainly think what was in the manifesto in terms of taking that on and nationalising it would have been amazing if we actually had not just a national health service, and it'd be good if we actually had that instead of a half privatised one, but also a nationalised pharmaceutical industry. I think it would make a major difference to people's health and wealth in this country. But that doesn't mean that all the drugs they produce are useless. Because as I said, I would not be alive if I thought that.
So there were lots of lies and dishonest. There's a lot of dishonesty
Mm.
and lying going on during that time. Um, and I'm just thinking, how do you see that, Ike? In what ways what kind of issues come out when you think of that dishonesty? Because I mean, one of the things that I'm still kind of not sure about is Boris Johnson being on his deathbed. I mean, some of the things that were being said just were not quite right. Some of the stories that were coming out didn't seem right. Is there anything that leaps to your mind?
I think none of us believed what was going on then.
Um, I think I mean, I did look back at the history of the WHO in relation to the pandemic declarations and pandemic preparations that they had. There was a dry run of this in 2009-10, which was exposed by the European Council, where they took a vote 58-2 to declare the swine flu pandemic to be a global fraud. And it was a global fraud carried out by the WHO as a result of lobbying by Big Pharma to sell drugs and vaccines which were no good and caused narcolepsy in large numbers of young people in Sweden. And one of the reasons why Sweden refused to abide by the general policy of lockdowns and the measures taken was because Techno had been through this in 2009 to 10. Sweden suffered perhaps the worst of all the European countries from the swine flu fraud. And the consequence of that was they decided they weren't going to go along with any of it. And they came off no worse than any other country after this. The main cause of the problem in Sweden, the number of deaths that they did have in Sweden, was mainly in the care homes, and it was a result of the terrible treatment of people in the care homes, or the poor treatment compared with what could have been done in the care homes, because a lot of temporary workers were moving around from one place to another in the care homes. But in Britain, there were multiple scandals of hair-raising proportions. The use of midazolam in care homes. I interviewed someone working in care homes, and she told me that they basically had sort of Dante's Inferno in the care homes, where they would eventually leave people to die in dying rooms inside the care homes. They were some places they were dishing out midazolam, which is a breathing suppressant for people who've got double pneumonia with COVID. And the consequence of that is it accelerates their death rather than delays their death. And so these type of measures, quite apart from the longer term history of the conquest of the WHO by CEPI, by Gavi, by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, which is well documented by an investigative research paper produced by Politico in conjunction with Die Welt, in which they showed that they gained control through these organizations. These four organizations gained control of the WHO and set the agenda as to what constitutes a pandemic. And they had done multiple preparation planning operations in order to scare the world into taking action when they declared a pandemic. And it was a pandemic waiting to happen because they had the instruments to panic the world into thinking that there was a desperate and urgent crisis, which they all profited from. And unfortunately, many countries went along with it, or nearly every country went along with it. Those countries that did the least actually generally did the best.
I think we should come to the end because we've been talking quite a long time here.
Yes, you'll have fun editing this.
I'm interested to hear what you think about the division on this issue, because there's been lots of divisive issues in the past 10 or
Mm.
so years. I mean, we've had Brexit, um, we've had other things, but this lockdown and COVID idiots and Cov idiots and uh, deniers and all these words that were going around at the time. Do you think that that will ever be forgotten and people will just get on with it? Have you both forgotten the kind of hard words that were said about each other?
No.
In relation to the antagonism, I don't feel any antagonism to people. I feel sorry for those people who were convinced into taking mRNA vaccines, and I'm feel sorry for those people who were convinced to support lockdowns. And most, but when people remain silent about this, as they do at the moment, I think that's because most people, yourself accepted because of your own circumstance, but most people regret what happened and regret what they did in terms of let's condemning people for doing X, Y, and Z and so on. And I think that's why there's such a low uptake on the on the COVID vaccines now. My mother, for example, a couple of days ago, I saw her, or yesterday I saw her, and she said they're still writing to me asking me to take this, and she and her friends who are all over 80 years of age. She's 89 years of age. Well, nearly all of them say they've got that they say to the amongst themselves, they say, I've got long Pfizer. Well, is that a phenomenon? You know, so I think the bridges have to be built between those who were vaccinated and those who were not, between those who supported lockdowns and those who didn't, so that we don't enter the same, so we don't fall for the same cycles of lies and propaganda that I believe we fell for. And I was one of the first people to fall for it. So I'm well aware of how it happens, but I would never fall for that again.